what exactly is a cabaret? It's a small venue where social conventions are relaxed, and it became, because of that, the haunt of artists and intellectuals who would meet and experiment with new forms of artistic expression, as we'll see. And they emerged at the end of the 19th century in Paris and spread across Europe at the turn of the century. And I think when we think of cabarets, we think of Folies-Bergère, Moulin Rouge, and of course, Liza Minnelli in Cabaret. We'll come on to 1930s Berlin and cabaret, but first let's start with the first modern cabaret, and that was La Chat Noir, the Black Cat, which opened in 1881 in Montmartre. And it was a nightclub, as you can see here, where the customers sat at tables and drank alcohol. They were entertained by performers on a small stage, and the performers often mocked the social conventions and mocked the audience. It was a sort of that sort of venue. The master of ceremonies, who you can see, let me point to him, standing here, would introduce the acts and interact with customers. And the success of the Black Cat was guaranteed when there was a group of radical young writers and artists started to frequent it en masse, and they had to move to a new, larger premises twice. And on the third move, they ended up in the venue we see here, which was at 12 Rue Victor Massé. I mentioned mocking social conventions. Well, it actually had a name. It was called fumisma, a type of mocking humor that attacked all the values of society. It was a barrage of wit, satire, practical jokes, and general mischief, and often self-deprecating. The French word fumisma means chimney sweep, but it also means a joker or a crackpot or a fraud. It's that sort of feeling. And we'll see later that it was the cabaret that was the forerunner of Dada art movement, but we'll come back to that. In case you're wondering about the stage, yes, they did have what we call Chinese shadow theatre. It wasn't Chinese acts though. It was the same technique. It was very popular, as well as exhibitions, monologues, dance routines, and so on. It derived in a way from British musical tradition, and the musical came from developed in the Victorian period around about the 1850s, and the music hall developed out of saloon bar entertainment in Britain in the 1830s. So what the cabaret is, in a sense, is it's a combination of saloon bar entertainment and music hall entertainment, and it became popular, as I said, with radicals and artists, and it was designed to be shocking. And an important element was also what we call burlesque, which is mocking humor by caricaturing or exaggerating what is meant to be something serious. Incidentally, music halls faded away after 1918 because of increasing competition from cinemas, but cabaret, as we shall see, continued. The primary audience in Paris later became visitors to Paris, because Paris had a reputation for risque entertainment, and you found that in the cabaret. By the 1930s, particularly in America, a lot of the biting satire had disappeared, and the clubs became more associated with striptease. And many of those clubs closed in the 1940s and 50s, but I'm getting ahead of myself. This period we're talking about was known as La Belle Epoque, the beautiful epoch. And it was a period in general, it lasted from about 1875, a bit before the period we're talking about, and 1914, the beginning of the First World War. It was a period of optimism and advances, technical, scientific and cultural, artistic advances. It was actually named La Belle Epoque retrospectively following the horrors of the world wars, when it was seen nostalgically, I think, as a time of peace and prosperity. But as we shall see, the reality of this period was a bit different. Remember, there was a large underclass in France living in slums or as rural peasants. But the prosperous, it's true, the prosperous rich never had it so good. And they were looking for new forms of entertainment like the cabaret. And this poster for the Black Cat was produced by Théophile Steinlen. He was Swiss-born French painter, and he studied in Switzerland in Lucerne, and then he took a job in France and was encouraged to move to Montmartre in Paris. And he was introduced to the crowd of the Black Cat, and they commissioned him to produce this poster. In fact, he had, as it happened, he had a great affection for cats, and they appear in many of his posters and his art. And he was also one of the artists that was quite a large influence on Pablo Picasso, who arrived in Paris in 1900. And the famous people who went to the Black Cat, there's enormous, just a short list of the people who frequented the Black Cat: Claude Debussy, Émile Zola, Jules Verne, Alexandre Dumas, Louis Pasteur, Paul Signac, Auguste Strindberg, and of course, Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. And what we just watched was one of the acts at the Black Cat by Paola Verta, but she was dancing in the style of a more famous dancer, Louise Fuller, who I'll talk about next. Louise Fuller was an American actress and dancer, and in a way, a pioneer of modern dance. She first went on stage when she was 4 in America to perform Mary Had a Little Lamb, and her reception, she got thunderous applause and never looked back. She toured America and was successful across America, and someone told her she would be very well received in Paris. So she traveled to Paris, became a regular performer at the Folies-Bergère, and embodied the Art Nouveau movement. She had patents for stage lighting, colored gels, garments, and so on. But she also had many impersonators, as we've just seen, and she refused to, unfortunately, to allow herself to be filmed. She was never filmed. There's no film of her. There's many films of the period, well, not many, but a few films of her impersonators. And now, the dancer you might have heard of from this period is Isadora Duncan. Well, it was Louise Fuller who introduced Duncan to Paris, and later to be eclipsed by her. Although Fuller is still remembered in dance circles, and there's an occasional tribute performance of the work she introduced. And in I think it was 2016, there was a film made about her life called The Dancer. This poster, incidentally, by Jules Chéret, he was called the father of modern posters. He trained in Paris, in London. He was influenced by British poster design. And when he returned, he created many posters for cabarets and music halls and theatres. He was also known for many years as the father of women's liberation, because his women are, as you see here, joyous, elegant, and lively. They're always like this. And this became a type. I don't think today we'd perhaps call him the father of women's liberation for reasons I'll come on to. But what I wanted to, the reason I said that is because he stylized this type that was found in Paris of women who would engage in activities that were previous to taboo, short hair, low-cut dresses, and smoking in public. Although, as we'll see later, the reality of life in Paris was a lot different for most women. The Folies-Bergère opened earlier in 1869, but didn't reach the height of its fame until the 1890s. And it became renowned for extravagant costumes and nude dancing. And perhaps the most famous dancer was Josephine Baker.
But the setting is exactly the same. This is Josephine Baker on the stage of the Folies-Bergère at a moment of music hall history.
Now, she was African-American singer, dancer, and entertainer who caused a sensation by wearing a costume consisting only of a skirt made of artificial bananas and little else, although she's wearing a top in this film, as you heard. I thought twice about showing this video, but I'm showing it because it makes the attitudes of the period clear. And it also, I felt, acts as a contrast with this. And this is one of the most famous paintings at the Courtauld and captures a rather different mood of the same nightclub. It's called a bar at the Folies-Bergère, and it's, of course, by Edouard Manet. And it was the last work he painted. It's been subject to numerous interpretations. In fact, I could spend an hour on this painting alone. And I was thinking that perhaps next year I'll do exactly that. First of all, just a few brief comments today. Note the mirror behind is reflecting the barmaid and reflecting a person, but the reflection, if it's a flat mirror, which it is, you can see the base of the mirror behind her. It is in the wrong place. And we know from sketches he made, which we still have, that he intentionally moved the person. And in fact, X-raying of this photograph shows that he twice moved her out of the correct position. So it was very intentional that she be shown in this way, which raises the question of why, of course, which is one of the thoughts behind a number of the interpretations. But before I mention that, just point out the legs. Can you see top right up here, the legs of the trapeze artist that performed across the auditorium in front of the stage? And that added excitement to the performance. The other thing that was people found exciting was the lighting. It's electric lights, and they'd only been invented 2 years previously by the Edison Electric Light Company. And I believe the Folies-Bergère was the first venue in Paris to have electric lights. Now, Manet frequently went, as many artists did, to the Folies-Bergère and made sketches there, but he actually painted this work in his studio using one of the barmaids of the Folies-Bergère, Suzanne, who posed for him. Now, there's a book called 12 Views of Manet's Bar, and each chapter, there's 12 chapters, each chapter is a different interpretation of this painting. And just to give you a feel, I won't go through all 12, but for example, one of the chapters is a Marxist interpretation, talking about the commodification of life that is brought about by capitalist society. Even the woman has been commoditized. Now, it was known at the time that many, if not most, of the barmaids at the Folies-Bergère were prostitutes, and in other words, they were for sale like the items in front of her. So we see the glossy presentation of the champagne, the beer, the oranges in the dish. And like all commodities, she is also aiming to produce desire through representation. And therefore, the claim is that this is a study of the effects of capitalism and consumerism, and that she's selling herself like the other commodities present. Feminist interpretation is that women were very limited in the jobs they could take on, and so many were forced into prostitution. And it was known at the time, as I said, that at the Folies-Bergère, barmaids could be bought at the same time as you were buying a drink. And so it's possible that the person behind, reflected in the mirror, is actually a reflection of us. So it's a critique of the male visitor to the Folies-Bergère. And interestingly, none of the critics who commented on this painting admitted that or commented on prostitution, because it was something that couldn't be talked about in polite society. It was just something that people knew about at the time. So in other words, Manet is exposing the hypocrisy and drawing our attention to the exploitation of women, which he'd also previously done in his well-known painting Olympia. There's, let me give you one more interpretation. Psychological interpretation is to do with her. You might have wondered about her look. Well, there's been lots and lots of descriptions of this ambiguous look: daydreaming, coldly detached, tired and glum, absent, weary and dispirited. And another one is not quite focused on anything. And all of this creates this feeling of rejection, I think, in a way, or distance, reinforced by the hard textures, the marble top, the hard bottles that are surrounding her. It creates this conflict, if you like, between the availability or if you like, the psychological gap between the sexes. I won't carry on, otherwise I'd be spending too long on this painting. Maybe more another time. Let me just move on to the Moulin Rouge. It's perhaps the most famous cabaret in Paris alongside the Folies-Bergère. It was notorious at the time for lewd dancing and for employing, like the Folies-Bergère, as I said, also it employed prostitutes as waitresses and dancers. It opened in 1889, which was the year of the exposition, the Universal Exposition or exhibition in Paris, and the building of the Eiffel Tower. It's best known, the Moulin Rouge, as the birthplace of Can-Can, although we'll see in a moment that that isn't strictly correct. Montmartre was a bohemian village, and the founder of the Moulin Rouge intentionally wanted to create a risque venue where the rich could come to the countryside and slum it. Now, I said the countryside. At this time, Montmartre still had working windmills. In fact, it still, I know, has 2 standing windmills today. And this is by Vincent van Gogh. And he arrived in Montmartre in 1886, 3 years before the Moulin Rouge opened. He stayed with his brother near this windmill, which was then on the outskirts of Paris. In other words, Paris is one side of it and the other side is the countryside. By the way, if you're wondering about Renoir's Bal du Moulin de la Galette, yes, that's another bar dance floor nearby. Now, because it was opened the year of the Universal Exhibition and the building of the Eiffel Tower, visitors flooded to Paris from all over the world to that, and many of them visited the Moulin Rouge. So it was, if you like, the making of the Moulin Rouge. It was busy from day one, and it was seen to embody the spirit of progress and spirit of decadence of Paris, a place where anything goes. The reputation of Paris at the time was established then and grew. In 1900, what's that, 11 years later, this giant wooden elephant was added to the club's garden. I think if you look to the left of the elephant, you can just see one of the sails of the windmill. Now, the elephant partly was put there to attract people, but it had a room in its stomach for even more intimate dances. And I assume that this photograph was staged, because there's a lot of people sitting, but no one has a meal, you'll notice, or even a drink in front of them. And there's also a woman in the background on the left holding an umbrella, so it might even be raining. So I assume this was a sort of publicity photograph for the Moulin Rouge. Now, one of the acts at the Moulin Rouge was La Gulu, and in 1890, His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, in other words, the future Edward VII, was on a private visit to Paris and booked a table to see Louise Weber, whose nickname was La Gulu, which means the glutton. Her reputation had already crossed the Channel to London, but she, while dancing, recognized him in the audience, and with her leg in the air and her head in her skirts, she called out, "Hey, Wales, the champagne's on you." This poster is by Toulouse-Lautrec, and one of his paintings we'll see later was in the entrance. He was very closely connected with the Moulin Rouge. He became a fixture. And he was commissioned to produce this 6-foot advertisement. And in fact, the poster launched his career and made him famous overnight, this poster. It turns a spotlight on the crowded dance floor, and we see two people here. In front, the man is the boneless acrobat and dancer, Valentine Le de Souza, the boneless one, it means. And La Gulu behind him with dancing the can-can. Her skirts lifted for the finale of the can-can, or the show as it was called in France. The Toulouse-Lautrec poster was a 4-color lithograph, and something like 3,000 copies were made and distributed around Paris. The Valentin, the no-bones Valentin, was actually previously a wine merchant turned can-can dancer, and men danced the can-can to entertain the crowds. And he had what seemed like an elastic body, which is why he was called No Bones, and very acrobatic dance moves. Notice how she, La Gulu, is drawn with just a few lines, and the white of her petticoats contrasts with the black silhouettes. This is a very novel and bold style, because previously posters in Paris were very text heavy. They were just full of text. So this was an innovation, a breakthrough. And incidentally, I've shown you 2 posters already. This poster predates the other 2 we've seen, if you remember the dates. So it was very influential on poster design. In fact, it was Toulouse-Lautrec's first attempt at lithography, and it made him a star overnight. Now, Jeanne Avril was a lifelong friend of Toulouse-Lautrec, and she commissioned him to produce this poster. She's actually dancing in the Champs-Élysées at the Jardin du Paris in 1893. And again, Lautrec, it's lithographed, and he used several stones. You use 1 stone for each color. And he's created a very bold composition here. There's a radically skewed perspective, severe cropping, flattened forms, and sinuous lines, such as those describing her frilly costume. The can-can kick of her leg was her signature dance move, and it's echoed in the vertical thrust of the double bass gripped by the unseen, or we can just see the head of the museum bottom right, and the scroll of the double bass has been cleverly extended around the frame to frame the picture. And the neck, if you look closely down the bottom and up, has almost become organic in its form. You'll notice Avril doesn't look particularly happy to be there. It looks as though she's performing for our benefit, not hers. And at the time, she wasn't regarded as a conventional beauty. In fact, critics described her as having a nanny goat face. I don't know whether that's fair or not, but she also had a nervous twitch that made her screw up her nose like a rabbit, but she was extremely successful. She was hired by the Moulin Rouge in 1889, and a few years later she headlined at another nightclub, the Jardin du Paris that I mentioned. And it was in 1895 that La Gulu, who I mentioned before, who was the most famous dancer in Paris, left the Moulin Rouge, and Avril was chosen to replace her. So they were moving between the famous dancers. These were probably the two most famous, were moving between cabarets and nightclubs. Now, Avril was graceful, soft-spoken, melancholic, in many ways the very opposite of the boisterous La Gulu. So both types were popular. And you'll also notice from the previous poster and from this one that at this time the can-can wasn't performed usually by troops of dancers, but by a single dancer or a pair of dancers. And originally it was a dance that became popular in the music halls in the 1840s, and it was later often performed by prostitutes in brothels. But by the 1890s, by this period, you could earn a living as a full-time dancer like La Gulu and Jean Avril, who were highly paid for their performances. The dance was very active. It often had an explosive entrance. They would enter by jumping through a paper wall, or coming down a rope, or coming in on a slide, and it was full of cartwheels and splits and high kicks. I wonder whether to mention it, but just for those that are wondering, the excitement of the can-can was largely down to the exotic underwear of the dancers and the lifting of the skirts. The police would visit to check the performers were wearing underwear, which wasn't always common at that time. And also they checked that the underwear or the drawers of the period were typically, they weren't stitched together between the legs. And so the police also checked that their drawers were stitched together. Henri Toulouse-Lautrec was associated with the Moulin Rouge from the beginning. Oh, I mentioned a painting earlier. It's this one. This one, I'm showing it quite small, but it was a large painting. Equestrienne at Le Cirque Fernando was the painting that you would see when you entered the foyer of the Moulin Rouge. So a lot of the sort of decoration, the posters and so on, were carried out by Toulouse-Lautrec. And this painting at the Moulin Rouge has portraits of the regulars. You can see in the middle of the painting here is Toulouse-Lautrec himself. Next to him is his cousin, who was a doctor. Behind him, in fact, directly behind here, is La Gulu, arranging her hair, and next to her is Jane Avril socializing, and the woman here is May Milton, whose face is harshly lit here, an acid green. She was a singer at the Moulin Rouge. Now, at some point, someone, Toulouse-Lautrec or his dealer, cut down the canvas and removed Milton on the right of the canvas. It's possibly to make it more saleable, because her appearance, this ghoul on the right, made it harder to sell. But we don't know why. By 1914, the cut section had been reattached to the painting, which is why you can see it as it is today. Or you could if you visited Chicago. This is Syrah, the Sha'u, or the can-can. Sha'u, incidentally, literally means a sort of a ruckus or an uproar. And it shows here the can-can being performed at the Moulin Rouge. This modulation of light and shade is obtained using, and you can see it, I think, here, hopefully you can see it on your screen, by means of thousands of small dots, a technique that was called pointillism, or sometimes divisionism. You might have heard both. They refer to different aspects of the work. Pointillism is a style of brushwork consisting of lots of tiny dots. Divisionism is more concerned with color theory, on which the color of the dots is based. And Syrah would, based on this color theory, would put contrasting dots of color next to each other, so that when you stood back from a distance, the colors merged together, because you couldn't see the individual dots, into the color that he wanted. But by doing it that way, the result made the colors much more vibrant or shimmering even. So it brought the picture to life. That was the basis of the rationale behind divisionism or pointillism. And this painting was very influential on later artists, both the symbolists, the fauvists, the futurists, cubists, and so on, because it was exhibits and was steeped in the line and color theories of the period, of which there were many. It was a time of deep thought about the meaning of or what lines and colors might mean. For example, horizontal lines meant calmness, and by further association that related to equilibrium and wisdom. Someone's just asked, was it? Yes, it I don't know how long, but it was. They were individually put on. It was time intensive. The question is, was producing all these dots time intensive? Yes, it took a long time. They were individually painted and the colors individually chosen. It wasn't done using a mask. The dancer's legs, the angled lines like the dancer's legs and the double bass here imply dynamism, which was associated with gaiety, voluptuousness. And the painting, as we can see, is not abstract, but it's what you might call schematic, is another word that's sometimes used for this sort of painting. It means that it was naturalistic, but elements had been omitted that were not necessary for the intended purpose or meaning. Simplified is another word. And you'll notice also that it's got flat planes of color and it lacks perspective. It's flattened. And this was the influence of Japanese prints, which were very influential in artists of the period. You'll notice also that it looks quite, but particularly with the dots of color, it looks quite precise and mathematical. but the subject matter is sexually provocative with its flying skirts and suggestion of male voyeurism. Notice the chap at the bottom right, who a friend of Seurat described as half randy observer of the scene, and this contrast between the mathematical and the voyeuristic or the sexually provocative is was another element of this painting that was appreciated at the time. Now, Gino Severini was influenced by Seurat, and he greatly admired him, both in terms of the technical approach and the subject matter. He wrote in his autobiography, "I looked to Seurat as my point of departure and my master." Now, Severini was a futurist, and just to remind you, it was in 1909 that Filippo Tommaso Marinetti published his Manifesto of Futurism in fact, not Italian, but the French newspaper Le Figaro. And that manifesto rejected everything in the past, admired speed, technology, youth and violence, and therefore it admired fast cars, aeroplanes, and industrialization, the industrial city, and so on. It dismissed art critics, it dismissed good taste, and it glorified in science. In fact, Severini said, one of the main causes of our artistic decline lies beyond doubt in the separation of art and science. An interesting comment, I thought, which I sort of touched on when I talked about art and science a few talks ago. A key concept of futurists was what they called universal dynamism, that is, a world in conflict, in flux. And their aim was to render this dynamic feeling itself in the work of art. They thought artists should take inspiration from what they called the tangible miracles of contemporary life. And this idea was taken further and explained in a pamphlet called Technical Manifesto of Futurist Painting by Umberto Boccioni, that was published shortly after the Manifesto of Futurism. But in that, neither document specified what style one should use, and different futurist artists used different techniques. And it was Severini who came into contact with Cubism in Paris in 1911 and adopted some of the Cubist techniques. And you can see here that this painting looks like some of the synthetic cubism. If you remember the two types, analytic and synthetic. Analytic was the breaking down into cubes and component parts, and the synthetic was more collages, sticking paper and lines on flattening the space. And you can see that to some extent both techniques are used here. Switching cities, that's I'm switching now from Paris to Vienna. This is the Fledermaus, or the Bat Cabaret, which was founded in 1907, a bit later than the early Paris cabarets, on the initiative of the Vienna Workshop, which was a cooperative of artists. Now, it was opened in an unassuming basement, and the artist turned it into a dazzling, elegant bar space by covering it in maiolica, mosaic tiles, 7,000 of them, and that was recreated in the Barbican in the exhibition that inspired this talk that was held at the Barbican in 2019 into 2020. And this is the recreation you see on the right of the bar space of the Bat Cabaret. The work, the interior, that we see here was actually planned by Joseph Hoffmann and carried out by the artisans and artists of the Vienna workshop, which included a number of well-known names like at the time Gustav Klimt and Oskar Kokoschka. The poster you can see was by Berthold Loeffler, who was a painter and designer who studied in Vienna. And when the time he produced this poster, he became a professor at the Vienna School of Applied Arts and taught there till 1935. This bar, this colourful bar we see here, led to the next room, which was completely whitewashed. It was a whitewashed auditorium with a traditional stage and boxes for the audience, but all in white. And the performances here at the Bat Cabaret were satirical plays, shadow theatre again, avant-garde dance, poetry readings, and musical performances, some of them humorous, some of them more decadent. Switching to London, this is a cabaret called A Night in the Cave of the Golden Calf referring to the golden calf in the Bible, created by Frieda Striedenberg, and it was in Hedden Street, just off Regent Street. The building's still there, but it later became a post office and it's now a bar. So in Hedden Street, downstairs, it opened in 1912, just before the outbreak of World War I, and it epitomized decadence, and it quickly became the haunt of the wealthy and aristocrats as well as bohemian artists. And it introduced this new idea of this new concept of nightlife and provided a model for future nightclubs in London. It started with a Night in the Cave of the Golden Calf. It was decorated by Spencer Gore. It had Russian ballet-inspired murals. It had contributions by Jacob Epstein, Wyndham Lewis, Eric Gill, who designed the motif, which was like a phallic golden calf in the reception area. And it was here that it was understood that the cult of Oscar Wilde could continue to be worshipped. It was described as a place given up to gaiety and brazenly expressive of the libertarian pleasure principle, is the way they put it in their publicity material. And one writer wrote, "At the root of these evils lay the name of Oscar Wilde, still unspoken in polite households. He may have been dead for more than a decade, but Wilde's decadence endured." The club was named actually in a very well-known and sensational divorce trial, and it was regarded as an unsuitable place for respectable women to visit. Notable visitors were Ezra Pound, Catherine Mansfield, Ford Madox Brown, Augustus John, Wyndham Lewis, and it was Wyndham Lewis, the painter and critic and co-founder of the Vorticist movement, who produced the poster we see here, and who also produced this chalk and watercolor painting of a dance at the club. Isadora Duncan, by the way, was also a dancer at the club and renowned for the sensuality of her dancing. And she inspired Nina Hamnet, who became known as the Queen of Bohemia, who danced naked at the club. This is, as I said, a watercolor by Wyndham Lewis of one of the acts. And I think it helps if although it's very difficult to understand perhaps, if I read a description of the acts in the Times, because you'll see from the description how eclectic, how varied the acts were. On the opening night, there would be dances from Goya's La Caprichos, Morris and hieratic dances, and a scene from Breton Wake of quite Hogarthian character. Spanish gypsies will sing their old mysterious lore, a feature entirely new to any English stage. So as you can see from that quote, it was a complex mixture of different cultures and forms of dance and reading. So we move on to Zurich. This is a postcard, by the way, of a lost painting by Marcel Janco called Cabaret Voltaire, and it was Cabaret Voltaire that was the birthplace of Dada, which led to Surrealism, perhaps one of the most influential art movements of the 20th century. And Cabaret Voltaire is where artists who fled the war, sought refuge from the war, would meet and practice attacking, questioning, deconstructing, parodying the system, social, cultural system that brought the war in the first place. Incidentally, Janco was a Romanian and Israeli artist, architect and art theorist, and he grew up in Bucharest and traveled widely at the start of World War I. He went to Zurich. He originally actually went there to study chemistry, architecture and drawing, but he met Hugo Ball, who was performing at what became Cabaret Voltaire. And because he couldn't sell his paintings, Janco earned a living as a cabaret performer, singing Romanian folk songs and playing the accordion. So I just mentioned Hugo Ball. He was essentially the founder of the Dada movement in Europe, in Zurich, in 1916. He was born in Germany, studied sociology and philosophy before moving to Berlin in 1910 to become an actor. And he volunteered to join the army, but the army rejected him on medical grounds. But then, after Germany invaded Belgium, he was disillusioned about the aims of the war and regarded the war as a mistake. And because of that, and he was vocal about that, he was considered a traitor, and he left Germany for Zurich with the poet, you can see here, Emma Hennings, whom he would later marry. And it was in 1916 that he wrote the Dada Manifesto and his views of the terrible state of society that led to the war. And in particular, he rejected any philosophy or religion that claimed any form of ultimate truth, which is the essence of Dada, really, the rejection of any form of religion or philosophy. He died when he was quite young, when he was 41, of stomach cancer. Quick switch to Rome. This is the restaurant Baltic Attack, founded in 1921, a bit later, on the initiative of Marinetti, the founder of Futurism. And Marinetti asked, the owner asked another futurist, Giacomo Balla, to design the interiors. And the interesting thing is that the work, the designs, this you see here is looking up at the ceiling, the work on the right, was lost for a century. It was hidden by a false ceiling and wallpaper. And the building became owned by the Bank of Italy, who didn't know it was there. And then when they were having redecoration done, it was discovered, and they handed the building to allow the public to enter, and the original ceiling and other works was exposed. Just to finish with the style, just to give you an indication of the style, or is it the humor of the futurists, Marinetti condemned pasta. Pasta, he said, is an absurd Italian gastronomic religion, and eating it sorry, eating it causes pessimism, nostalgic inactivity, and neutralism. And another futurist wrote, spaghetti poisons us. Our thoughts wind round each other, getting mixed up and tangled like the vermicelli we have taken in. And futurists recommended eating rice instead. I still don't know whether it's serious or I think it's humor. Another club, just to mention, that opened in Rome is the interior was designed by Fortunata de Piero, who also produced this poster, or in fact, I think it's an invitation card to the Cabaret del Diablo, based on or inspired by Dante's Divine Comedy. And it was separated into 3 levels. There was the Inferno, or hell, Purgatorio, purgatory, and Paradiso, or heaven. Paradise, heaven, was light blue, purgatory was green, and Inferno was black with red lighting. And the furniture on each level was designed with flames or hearts, lances, and pyramids. So it was all designed to fit the club. The slogan at the top, by the way, means everyone to hell. Strasbourg, just briefly, I'll mention Strasbourg because of this particular dance hall or club in Strasbourg, which was described as the Sistine Chapel of abstract art, designed by 3 artists. Theo van Doesburg was in charge of the 2 cafes and 2 dance halls, which we see here. There's an original photo on the left and the restored cafe dance hall on the right. His wife, Sophie Tauber, designed the entrance hall, the tea rooms. Jean Arp designed the basement, the passages, and the billiard room. And all 3 artists designed the stairwells. And it was heavily influenced, as you can see, I think, by Piet Mondrian. And it was an expression of what's called der Stil, which means the style, which sometimes is called neoplasticism, an art movement of this period, which I haven't got time to talk more about at this stage. But I'm showing you because I think it's a wonderful recreation, which I believe the public can now visit. So moving on to my final city, which is Berlin, perhaps the most famous location for nightclubs and cabaret. And it's Berlin between the wars, or essentially from the end of the First World War up to 1933. Now, following Germany's defeat, the German monarchy collapsed and the Weimar Republic was formed in 1919. And it was until Hitler became chancellor in 1933, Berlin gained this reputation for being the bawdiest and most degenerate city in Europe. If I quote from, it's actually Christie's website, its cabaret acts were outrageously explicit, its brothels were infamous. It said that cocaine could be bought in the city's nightclubs for half the price of a decent dinner. And it was the Weimar Republic that removed restrictions. And so there was a period of social liberalization that took place in the city. And we've seen that cabaret was something that was created, established in Paris a long time, 40 years previously, but it took off in Berlin. And in Berlin, the entertainment revolved around sex, sexual liberation, and political satire of any party or political leader. And many Germans became concerned that this culture was undermining German moral values. Now, for the wealthy, it was an exciting period. Women were given the right to vote in 1919 in Germany, and there was a new style called the New Woman, which that is women who developed, dressed in men's clothes, a masculine style, had short hair, would visit cabarets and bars, and many saw the new woman as symbolizing modernity and progress, but others saw her as a dangerous threat to German society. And we'll see that, in fact, the majority of women, for the majority of women, the reality was very, very different. Anita Berber was, who we see here, was raised by her grandmother in Dresden and moved to Berlin when she was 16. She started when she was 16 as a cabaret dancer, and by 1918, when I think she was 19, she was working in film, and over the next 7 years she appeared in something like 25 films. Now, she broke every convention of the period. She had short hair, which was regarded as scandalously androgynous. She had love affairs with both men and women. It's said that she dated the young Marlene Dietrich. It was in 1919 that she began dancing in the nude. In one appearance, she appeared on stage with nothing on except for high heels and a monkey round her neck. She danced erotic, bizarre fantasies, which were fueled, unfortunately, by a mixture of ether, chloroform, cognac, and morphine. And I think this painting by Otto Dix, of which a bit more later, conveys the exotic feel of her performance. Now, unfortunately for her, the public lost interest in her extremes, and she died a pauper in 1928, aged just 29, of, we think, tuberculosis, although there's a rumor that she died of an overdose of morphine. The Tiller Girls were a popular act. Now, this is a popular act in Berlin, but they were first formed by John Tiller in Manchester in 1889. And by the 1920s, there were several Tiller troupes of women in various major cities, including America. So it's very difficult to untangle who were the true Tiller girls. And in Berlin, the impresario Hermann Haller hired them, the English troupe, in fact, to perform. And other troupes were soon created in Berlin called Tiller Girls. But Haller's Tiller Girls used the slogan, often copied, never equaled. And they had rave reviews. And what the reviewers loved about the performance was its dynamism, its energy, and its precision. Now, although, as I said, they were British, they were commonly misidentified as American. And they were held up as an example of the machine age aesthetic. One writer found their identical and precise movements symbolized industrialization and mechanization of the age, and felt it removed any eroticism because it reduced their individual body parts to what the reviewer called mass ornament. And a leading theatre critic, another critic, wrote, the American, he thought they were American, but they were British, the American girls are a sight worth seeing and a standard to follow. Beauty on stage, not through nakedness, but through motion. Now, it's interesting because I think the Haller Tiller girls never danced naked. So I assume here that Karl Hoffer is showing a different troupe called Tiller Girls. And also many of those performances, when they did perform naked, they didn't move, they stood in static tableau. And they were also seen to be the embodiment of what I call new women, sexless, short hair, slim bodies, precise mechanical movements, young, self-assured, independent. But as we shall see, the reality was very different. Women, if they could get work, which was difficult, received low pay, worked long hours, and had no chance of career advancement. Now, Jean Marmann was a German painter who worked in Berlin, studied in Paris, Brussels, and Rome, and was influenced by all the movements of the time, all the art movement, symbolism, Art Nouveau, and the decadent movement. And when the First World War started, she fled to Paris. And when the war ended, she returned to Berlin, but with no money. So she found work as a commercial artist, working in fashion and designing posters. And she became known for her illustrations of Berlin society. And she often depicted women, from the self-important socialites to street singers and prostitutes. She, in fact, found Berlin, she said, brutal and hierarchical, very structured society compared with Paris, which she loved. And her work is often compared with George Grosz, who we'll see later, and Otto Dix. And she worked for magazines like this magazine you see on the right, Simplicissimus, very hard to say, Simplicissimus. In 1933, she was condemned as Jewish. She wasn't Jewish when the Nazis came to power, and they opposed, banned her blatant disregard for the appropriate female submissiveness, because a lot of her work showed dynamic women and also many images of lesbians. Amazingly, she survived. She stayed in Germany and continued to produce art and work through the Second World War. Now, she earned money designing advertisements. She refused to exhibit the work she produced at home, and she made money also by selling secondhand books from a hand cart. And she would sit quietly in cafes, quietly drawing human behavior. She once said, "I have always wanted to be just a pair of eyes, walking through the world unseen, able to see others, but without them noticing her." She even experimented with Cubism and Expressionism, both very dangerous because both were condemned as degenerate by the Nazis. So she survived through the Second World War and died in Germany in 1976, an important artist in Germany, but not recognized internationally, I think, until the Tate exhibition that included her work in 2018, where suddenly in the last few years, she's become very well-known, very famous internationally. Otto Dix, this is perhaps his best-known work, called Metropolis. And it shows a nighttime scene from the Weimar Republic, 1927. It makes it clear that behind the glamour, there was an enormous dark side that I mentioned earlier. In the middle panel, we see a dance bar and how the wealthy entertain themselves. There's a jazz band playing. The couples, I think, are dancing what was called the shimmy, where you hold your body still and shake your shoulders backwards and forwards. The women are wearing expensive jewelry and fashionable dresses. But in the left panel, there's a double amputee watching as prostitutes flaunt themselves while a soldier, possibly dead, lies on the cobbles. And on the right-hand panel again shows a group of high-class prostitutes who are strolling past a soldier with no legs begging in the street. So Otto Dix shows how war veterans were marginalized and despised by the wealthy, who'd made fortunes during the war and who engaged in non-stop entertainment. Now, this was the beginning of hyperinflation. There was a lack of work that meant that many former middle-class women were forced by economic circumstances into prostitution. And society, remember I said it was hierarchical, it was reduced to the super rich and the unemployed who survived by begging and prostitution. The German hyperinflation is legendary paper money became worthless. People had to carry sacks or wheelbarrows of money around. Prices increased by the day. Prices could go up while you were eating a meal from the time when you started the meal. In 1919, a loaf of bread cost 1 mark, 1919, and by 1923, the same loaf of bread would cost 100 billion marks. This is the last image I'll be showing you today. It means, oh, I've translated it, beauty, thee will I praise. It's an illustration actually from George Gross's book, Ecce Homo, in which he saw himself continuing the satirical tradition of William Hogarth. And in fact, it wasn't so much satire for either artist, but a realistic reporting of what they saw in the society around them. Society was so exaggerated, they hardly need to exaggerate for satirical purposes. Now, Ecce Homo caused a furore in Germany to the extent that Gross actually applied for a gun license to defend himself. It was a vicious satire of post-war German life, satirizing politicians, capitalism, prostitution. It had prostitutes, mutilated veterans, beggars and drunks in various stages of despair, lust, rage, and it was banned by the German government. He was taken to court, charged with producing pornography, and found guilty and fined 6,000 marks. He left Germany as Hitler came to power as Chancellor in 1933 and travelled to New York. In Germany, in his absence, he was labelled degenerate and his work was seized and destroyed. Luckily, not all of it was destroyed. He was a successful artist in America, and he was eventually stripped of his German citizenship in 1938 and became an American citizen. But in 1950, after the Second World War, he started to drink heavily. He decided he wanted to return to Germany in 1959, and 2 months later, after a night of heavy drinking, he fell down the stairs and died. So we've come a long way from the Black Cat. Folies-Bergère, Moulin Rouge, we went through Vienna and London, on to, remember, the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich, to Rome, Strasbourg, and finally the extremes of Berlin in the 1920s. Now later cabaret evolved into nightclubs, and today I think it's become a much tamer form of entertainment. Thank you.